Television is often seen as a superficial way to entertain yourself and waste time. That being said, TV can actually tell us a lot about how society has progressed from point A to point B. So, by taking a look at some key shows throughout the decades, here's television as a reflection of society. Let's start with the pre-1950s with The Little House on the Prairie. This, originally written and released in 1974, is based off of the book adapted by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it follows, like an autobiography, the Ingalls family and their move from Kansas to Minnesota on the banks of Plum Creek in the late 1800s. They settled down in Walnut Grove along the way. In the series' pilot episode, titled A Harvest of Friends, that was released on September 11th, 1974, the Ingalls family moves to Plum Creek in Minnesota, and Charles gets a job in Hanson's mill for the lumber to build the little house. Charles has a series of failed business deals with neighboring families and falls out of a tree while retrieving a kite. Despite his bad luck, at the end he discovers a harvest of friends, aka the title, rather than crops, effectively starting off the series. This show's hard work and family life are key central themes in this show, which is something that was really exemplified throughout the 1950s. Furthermore, the government forcing families off of their properties is seen often throughout the show and is reflective of real-world issues happening during the same time period. Some cultural artifacts that we see during the show are the stove and kitchenette was very interesting, and people had to use coal to cook, and equipment was much heavier. In terms of social norms and clothing, the show is pretty accurate. However, one thing that is not included in the show is the way that minority groups were treated pre-50s. Husbands were much more controlling over women, and racial tensions would have been present at the time. The show really exhibits the frontier and pioneer life that was so common in the 50s and the excitement of starting a new life and new family in a far-off place. Now moving on to the actual 50s with the show I Love Lucy. This was originally set in an apartment building in New York City, much like the 90s show Friends. I Love Lucy centers on Lucy and Ricky Ricardo, who is a singer and band leader, along with their landlords and best friends throughout the years. Lucy is a very ambitious girl with a zeal for stardom and a knack for getting her and her husband in trouble whenever she yearns for the spotlight. In a certain episode of I Love Lucy, Season 1, Episode 30, titled Lucy Does a Commercial and released on May 5th, 1952, Lucy comes across a commercial opportunity and explains to a man named Fred just exactly what it would entail. Ricky tries to help but accidentally electrocutes Lucy in an attempt to help her and Fred scheme. When the commercial is recast, Lucy has a mediocre audition and is later shown extremely intoxicated. She's dancing and singing at the end of the episode, embarrassing Ricky on stage for the whole room to see. Along with the 50s, friendship and opportunity are key themes in this episode. The dangerous chemical ingredients in many beauty and food products in the 50s is clearly demonstrated in this episode when Lucy is given a substance that has 23% alcohol and other kitchen sink chemicals. Medicine and advertising containers were much different in the 50s. This theme can also be seen throughout women's clothing and hair. This is present in a lot of cultural artifacts throughout the show. The show accurately reflects the era it was set in, mainly because it also happened during the 50s, and the clothing, colors, and lighting were reminiscent of that time. Now moving on to the 60s with The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is a science fiction and fantasy television series that was created by Rod Serling in 1959 and ran till 1964, which was quite different from the normal television shows set in that time period, because every single episode presented its own separate story, which was often either a play on morality or science fiction and involved people who faced unusual or extraordinary circumstances. In Season 3, Episode 27, called Person or Persons Unknown and released on March 23, 1962, a man named David Gurney wakes up from a night of wild partying and realizes that nobody, including his wife, friends, and co-workers, recognize him, fearing that his identity has disappeared. When he's seen as insane, he's placed in an insane asylum where people tell him that his identity, David Gurney, does not exist, and is only a figment of his imagination. He is convinced that this is not true and finds a photograph of him and his wife, which he thinks will disprove the fact that she claims he doesn't exist. But by the time he shows this to the authorities, the picture has changed and he is taken under custody again. And towards the end, he realizes that his wife is not the person that he knew at all. The episode's theme of identity and the loss of it is actually very indicative of what was going on politically in the 1960s. The 1960s were a time of many social and political movements representing the diverse voices and concerns amongst the fragmented parties and groups of people in America. Now moving on to the 70s, we have The Brady Bunch, which was a TV show created by Sherwood Schwartz and starred a very large blended stepfamily. The show originally aired in 1974, but quickly became an international success and an American television icon. In season 3, episode 12, titled Getting Davy Jones, that aired on December 10th, 1971, Marcia and her friends are in charge of the entertainment committee for their school's prom, and they have to find someone who needs to perform. That's when real-life English singer Davy Jones, who is in town to do some promotions, becomes the point of their searches. The entire episode follows them, as well as everyone else in the Brady family, helping Marcia get through to Davy Jones, but when they seem nowhere, she decides to abandon her quest. At the very end, we see Davy Jones successfully performing at their school's prom. The issues that the Brady Bunch faced were pretty domestic and almost always focused on the next-door neighbor trope. However, the show was very wholesome, and I think it was meant to provide a sense of escapism to families during the tough times of the time period. The Vietnam War, for example, was still shaking domestic life, and it encouraged families to really sit around the TV together after dinner and watch some wholesome, good old-fashioned values with their domestic lives. This kind of created the societal habit of family TV dinners. Finally, on to the 80s, we have Miami Vice, which was a 1984 television series produced for the NBC network. It follows two Vice Metro-Dade detectives working undercover in Miami's drug and prostitution underworld. While it only ran for 5 seasons, it is known for incorporating pop culture and music heavily in its episodes. The penultimate Season 1 episode, titled Evan, released on May 3, 1985, follows the Vice Squad conducting surveillance on an arms dealer named Guzman and his associate Evan Freed, who the episode is named after. After they go through a series of armed deals, armed races, a drunk Evan stumbles into the office, and Crockett realizes that they have a lot more in common, and their living on the edge backstory is very similar. This show is reflective of the arms and war races happening in the 1980s, including the Cold War and international tensions.